You really want your students to do great things? If you really want them to do great things, you must show them that there were people that came before them in Africa that looked just like them, that did incredible things. How can they believe in themselves if they don't know? You must first show them the fantastic things done by their ancestors. But the critical question is, do you know any of these critical things that Africans did long before anyone else? That's what I'm about. Reginald Stanley Sinkler here, historian, author, retired teacher, and disperser of African historical truth around the world. Because you have no idea what Africans did. So it's not your fault if you don't know, but it's your fault if you don't try to find out. It's critical to the success of your students. If your students are African American, but they can't even name one famous African in all of world history, especially Imhotep above the first doctor, you have limited those students intellectually. I introduce you to Imhotep, the first known physician in history. You must teach about him.
Remember when we were younger, we would hear some interesting tidbit about someone black who had invented something or done something significant in history, and we would wonder aloud, wow, I wonder why they don't teach us that in school. Well, I would argue some decades later that we're in no better position now with regards to our mainstream educational system and what it teaches our young people and our not so young people about our history. You know, Carter G. Woodson, the author of the book The Miseducation of the Negro, asserts that a man receives two educations, one that is given to him and the other that he gives to himself. Well, if we're about to take the long journey into looking into the historical contributions of people of African descent, where will we begin? I mean, what have we done? What have we contributed to world civilization in the areas of mathematics, science, architecture, astrology, astronomy, medicine? If we wanted to find out, where would we begin? Well, we can begin in the most ancient of days. We can begin with an African, a multi-genius of a man. His name, Imhotep.
Imhotep was the first multidimensional character in human history. There was no personality in human history that we can read about, that's written about before Imhotep, a black man. The first person with texture in human history. In other words, everybody before that was mentioned, you mentioned the name. You had the name of kings. You had their name, but you did not have any details about them. The first person we have details about in history is a black man, Imhotep.
His greatest contribution was in the science of medicine, that of being the world's first physician.
He had such a profound impact on the idea of what is a scientist, what is a thinker. See, Imhotep was a quintessential scientist. Not only was he the architect of the first massive stone building in history, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, but he also cataloged thousands of medicinal uses of plants. He didn't just sit and list plants. He said, this plant is used to help cure this. So you put this plant on your eye if your bee stings you on your eye. You take this plant, put it on an open wound, if this wound is taken. You take this plant if you're suffering from indigestion. You take this. 3,000 medicinal uses of plants.
Imhotep is believed to have treated tuberculosis, gallstones, appendicitis, gout, and arthritis. He also performed surgery and practiced some dentistry. This is the world's oldest known surgical document, the Edwin C. Smith Papyrus. Edwin Smith was merely a purchaser of precious antiquities. He had no ownership in its genius. That belongs to the African Renaissance man, Imhotep. The Edwin C. Smith Papyrus is a medical book of 48 different surgical procedures written in exquisite detail, dealing with cranial sutures, the external surface of the brain, examination, diagnosis, and treatment of head injuries, fractures of the neck, collarbone, skull, nose, and arm, as well as tumors, cysts, sprains, and dislocations.
Numbers Fibonacci, yes, brought it to Europe first in 1202, but the Europeans didn't accept it because the church said numbers are works of the devil. It's as late as the 17th century.
Just to show you how things are upside down today in terms of information, listen to what Plato wrote in his diary.
He said that he became more alert and more human being. He became more, you see, Malone became a more human being. Not just human being, you became a more yourself. You achieve your destiny when you go to Kemet school. You became a human being, more human. We are a human being already, but more human being. That means more wise. And when you go to Kemet school, when Plato himself compare what they do in Kemet school, I give Greek because it will be no debate. You see, it's our school in Greece, the way we are doing things is just for creatures like pigs. You see, like pigs. You see, and he said, myself, I'm ashamed. Myself as a plate, I'm ashamed. We do things like that, is a shame. And also, not only for myself, for all Greek, the Greek world is a shame. What we can do, our education, when you compare with a Kemet, is not even for human beings, it's just for pigs, for animals.
Because it's from that area we find the oldest documented civilization in the world. From the Nile Valley, we know that the people of ancient Kemet were African, had dark skin, and we do know that from the Nile Valley, our ancestors created the first alphabet called Meta-Neter, which the Greeks renamed hieroglyphics. We also know that our ancestors created the first paper, which was made from the papyrus plant, the first clock, which was a water clock. Another Greek name for that is Calypsodra, but a lot of the things that have laid the foundation for us today that have allowed us to be able to write down our history and to be able to pass that on, we've only been able to do that with many of the inventions that our ancestors created.
Whether you're dealing with engineering or technology, when you talk about writing and reading, when you're talking about the refinement of speech, when you talk about grammar or the dialectic, or if you're talking about concepts of astronomy or music.
The people from the Nile Valley were the very first people to develop a concept of time. Time is a concept that sprang from the minds of African people. They were the first people to divide the day into 24 hours. They were the first people to develop the calendar, 365 and a quarter days. They were the first people to build with stone. They were the first people to develop systems of education. The first universities, they invented writing, they invented paper, they developed libraries. They were the first physicians, the first psychologists, the first dentists, the first brain surgeons. They were the first governors, the first rulers, the first men and women to orient structures to celestial bodies in order to harness the spiritual energy that's generated within a structure that is properly aligned to celestial spheres. So in other words, they were human beings who knew how to manifest the power of God on earth.
I think the most important contribution that was made was the creation of a system that transfers and transmits information from one generation to the next one. And when the Perank, P-E-R-A-N-K-H, which is the Temple of Life, was created in Kemet, it allowed the transference of information to come down from one generation to another, which would include the study of the heavens, it would include the study of nature around, it would include understanding geology, understanding geography, and everything that every generation learned, they would hand it down to the next generation in order to improve the conditions of the human family.
Greeks and others desired to go to learn, and the foundations of mathematics and science that they contributed, they learned from the Africans. In fact, has its root in Africa. In other words, the great achievement of the Greeks in science, mathematics, philosophy, art, and culture has its root in Africa. In fact, Greek philosophy was considered a foreign philosophy. Many of the Greek philosophers were killed or exiled or had to commit suicide because they were teaching a foreign philosophy. This book by George D.M. James details what was the legacy that the ancient Greeks obtained. When Thebes was established as a major university center a couple of 2000 BC and 1500 BC, the Greeks were not involved in the process. The Greeks did not come until another 1,000 years in any serious numbers to relate to the African development in the Great Temple Age, the third. And this enormity of Thebes was recognized by Homer in the Iliad or Odyssey. He refers to the greatest city of the ancient world being Thebes, or Waset, the city of 100 gates. And Dr. Chancellor Williams points out in his book that Thebes was an enormous development, and it is the major center and beginning of black history and black domination of world history.
Why don't our kids know these things? If all you teach
Most
about
anthropologists have been
and the
satisfied to
Oogaboo,
go
they'll
looking
never
for
know.
vanishing little tribes, utterly irrelevant, the Wooga and the Looga. And they go and they spend 6 months a year and they study all they know about the Looga. All their little ritual and their dances and their kinship system, who is my mother's brother, sister, son, etc. Utterly irrelevant to any illuminating vision of African civilization. And they come and they extrapolate masses of things about it. And so we have thousands and thousands of books about Africa that tell us absolutely nothing about the quintessential African.
Africans with jet black faces once walked the earth all alone, no other races, until they traveled to the other lands colder than the motherland, and then the cross began. That's when the frost began, the pigment loss began. The further north this man traveled as he crossed new land. The man in the ice who once walked in the sand, soon he began to lose his
This is a figure, a sculpture that was found
Get on the inside.
And one of the things that they have
He was still
discovered
African.
is that many of the sculptures of early Europe show various African types. In fact, 55,000 years ago, according to 3 labs, the University of Oxford, the University of Hawaii, the University of California at Berkeley have come to the conclusion that there are no people on the earth 55,000 years ago who are not black Africans.
They have trigonometry.
Look at this.
Go ahead.
Look at this. Who built like this? Awesome or what? Now look.
Everything is an echo and echo and echo. They haven't even begun to question the basics in this civilization. As Dr. Diop has shown, that a great deal of the Greek science, and we're not attacking the Greeks, because they had their own genius too, but the basis, all these things they claimed, you see, Hippocrates, taking sections. When you go and look at their medicine, I spoke in Atlanta to the Center for Disease Control. Africans had aspirin before us. They were using Salix capensis, which is salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They were using tetracycline 14 centuries ago in Nubia. They found the yellow-green flash of tetracycline in Nubian bones 14 centuries ago. They only started using that antibiotic in America in the 1950s. They pioneered in several operations. They pioneered in the cesarean operation. Dr. Finch has written a fine thing on the cesarean. At the time when that operation was experimental in Europe, people like Dr. Felkin went into Africa and observed the Banyoro surgeons performing the cesarean, and the mother was hale and hearty after 4 or 5 days. No woman survived the cesarean in Europe in the 1870s. None. No woman survived. And they observed the operation, the way they stitched, the way they opened the belly, the kind of instruments they used. They observed they were using one of the instruments, the cautery iron, which shuts fantastic skill. It was very minor tissue damage that caused great ruptures in the European hospitals. They found that Africans were using both anesthetics and antiseptics in their operating theaters at that time, when in Europe, Lister only introduced antiseptics 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation, which the witness said must have been going on for quite a while because the Africans were performing with routine skill what was then experimental surgery in Europe.
No wonder powers, no wonder she said, son, remember the powers in the knowledge.
Point to the fact that the calendar we use today is derived from the Egyptian.
Let me ask you something.
They were the first people
teach your class that
to
Africans
invent the
is in
second of time, the second of hour,
the minute, the second, the hour.
the hour, the minute. Their astronomical observations over many years produced these ideas, these precise quantities and volumes and times and standards, which were later to dominate the world. The Babylonians did not have any proper calendar. The Egyptians had the 365 and a quarter days. Uniquely shaped crown of the Egyptians. They found the palace facades that were later used by the Egyptians, and above all, they found the hieroglyphs, so that the world's first major writing system is not even Egyptian, it is Ethiopian.
Back in the day, schooling blind and unwise to the lies my professor was spewing forth like it was written in stone. I didn't know that under him, the truth was unknown.
Nation in astronomical circles that Kenneth Bretsch of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he said, the Africans have no business knowing any of this. All destroyed. And yet the most significant that we have 10 major medical texts in African languages. The first medical texts in the world are in African language. The first mathematical papyri which you saw this morning, that's African. Those are the first. Even today, with all the destruction, we could still go back to the African documents and show them on a screen. The Ebers Papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Smith Papyrus, which is 1500 BC. They have chapters on helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, circulation of the blood, the pulse, diagnostic percussion, all that, chapters, intestinal disease and all that 1500 years before Christ.
Quite clear, in the very early stages of civilization, something very unusual happened. I was with my wife in Egypt last summer and we went to Aswan. And I looked at a block, an obelisk, a stone obelisk which had been cut many centuries ago. And I looked at the way it had been cut, the perfection of the cut. I looked at the stone. And I wondered why they had abandoned this obelisk. They abandoned it, they said, because it had a flaw. And I looked carefully. It is true, my eyes are not what they used to be. I could not see this flaw, so I used my hands, which are extremely sensitive. And it had to be pointed out to me where the flaw was, and it was very clear to me it would have taken centuries for that flaw to really make a difference. But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. When the Japanese were building the pyramid, when they tried to put the stones in alignment, they cracked and broke and were badly scratched. When they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment, 1/1000th of an inch accurate, not a single stone was scratched.
Now listen
or
carefully.
cracked.
This is the basic
You are
message
dealing
of this
with
video.
people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
One of you, when you know what your ancestors did, because only then do you know what you can do.
You see, for Africans, being mediocre was never enough. Always remember the true history of African people, and you will strive to reach the excellence and perfection that those Africans achieved. Only your best will do.
The powers in the knowledge.
Reginald Stanley Sinclair. Add a little trivia for you. Anybody have any idea how long it took to graduate in schools in the Nile Valley in 2600 BCE? And it only took 40 continuous years of living in the temple studying, and after 40 years, you got to go home for the first time from age
A
7 to
priest was
42.
a man
You
who
don't
went
believe me? Listen
into
to
the
Dr. Best.
system of education,
He's
which we
from
call the
Ethiopia.
history system, from age 7, at the time when he was circumcised and brought in. At age 47, 40 years of training, studying the 7 liberal arts, science, law, engineering, all that goes with it, and he had
I think your students
qualified
need to
in
know
each
that
of his degrees.
years
He
that they spend in
became
college,
known
law
as a
school,
priest.
medical school would be nothing
So
compared to
that
the
means
40
that
years
you
of
who
study they
studied
had in
PhD,
college.
4
It kind
years
of
for the
changed their
bachelor's,
perspective.
2 years for your master's, and another 2 or 1 depending for your doctorate, you would have just begun to study. And you're talking about a long time of study. You would have been there 40 years without ever going to see your parents or anyone else.
The pyramid rises to a height of 481.5 feet. It is built of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest stone is 2.5 tons, and the largest stone is somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. If you were to take the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid, by the way, can you hear me in the back? I don't want you to miss any of this. If you could take all of the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid and cut it up into 1-foot blocks, you could build a wall that would circle 2/3 of the globe. And you know they built it without even using the wheel? They used to float 1,000-ton blocks of granite from Aswan 500 miles down the river, and they can't even do that today. The pyramid was oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The base of the pyramid, the side of each base of the pyramid was 755 feet, 6 inches, with an average error of 1/10,000th. The casing stones that covered the pyramid were so finely jointed that you could not and cannot insert a piece of your hair in between the joints, even today, where they are still in existence. The area of the base of the pyramid is 13 acres. But it's real interesting. If you look at the height of the pyramid, it is, if you measure it, it is the radius of a circle that you can create by turning the base of the square base of the pyramid into a circle. And therefore you can find the square base by the area of the perimeter of the square base by 2 pi r. So that means they had built the constant, the geometric constant of pi, into the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, which only, and it used to shine down to the grotto into a pool of water, and of course it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been anything like it in the world. Nothing. These are various kinds of surgery practiced in traditional Africa, particularly in East Africa, right about now. As I say, my pièce de résistance, my crowning glory. I won't say mine, but since I'm presenting it, I call it mine. Because if there's any single, if someone said, Dr. Finch, show one slide to make your entire point, it would be this one, of all the ones that I've shown. R.W. Falcon, a medical missionary traveling in Uganda in 1879, interested in traditional obstetrics, came upon this scene in a village in the Banyoro Kingdom of Uganda and was allowed to witness it. Woman, 20 years old, first pregnancy, in labor 3 days without progress. 3 men, one holding her abdomen, the other holding her stomach, and the other, as you see the surgeon, poised with a knife. Mutters an incantation, takes banana wine, I alcohol, washes his hands with it, washes the abdomen with it, then proceeds to cut her from the xiphoid process down to the pubis symphysis in what today is called a classical incision. Takes the cautery irons one by one, sealing off the bleeding points, opens up the peritoneum, opens up the uterus, takes out the baby, cuts the cord, clamps it, hands the infant to an assistant, then seals off the bleeding points again with the cautery iron that I showed you, turns the woman over on her side so the amniotic fluid would spill out, turns her back on her back, takes his fingers and goes inside the uterus and dilates the cervix from within. Now, the obstetricians and gynecologists in the room know what the significance of that is. You have to do that in order to let postpartum blood escape. Again, sealing off the bleeding points with red-hot cautery irons, then closing the uterus and the abdomen with 7 sharp spikes. Falcon observed mother and child for 11 days. The mother had 2 days of fever, which disappeared, and after 11 days, mother and child were alive and well. An elective cesarean section like this, elective, was not even done routinely in Europe until 20 years later. Falcon's informants say this was custom among their peoples, that when a woman could not push a baby out, they would hand her over to the surgeon. This has been going on for generations. This was no fluke. In fact, Falcon says you couldn't get this level of coordination and professionalism and surgical skill without a tried and true operation that had been going on for a long time. The surgeon obviously understood the concepts of anesthesia, antisepsis. He used wine, that is alcohol, to clean the surface and his hands, and hemorrhage control. Now, the anesthesia is the most confusing part, because the only thing that they will say is that that Falcon noticed, I should say, is that she was given a concoction of banana wine. But the only time she made a noise is when the surgeon introduced the knife at the beginning. She made a little noise in her throat, and then for the rest of the operation, she did not utter a sound, even though she was awake. So there was something else in that concoction than just grog. I don't even rule out the possibility there may have been, shall we say, psychogenic or hypnotic factors involved. You know, the neurologists in the room and the psychiatrists in the room, people like Pat Newton and others, know about endorphins, et cetera, et cetera. These are the biochemical substances within the body, created by the body, that cause anesthesia, that are released by things such as acupuncture. I'm speculating a little bit here, but I mean, I think all of this is a worthy speculation. The point is that this is a landmark, not merely in African surgery, this is a landmark in surgery, in a place at that time which was being called Darkest Africa. Had surgical technique that Europe had not, or America had not even achieved up to that time.
You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
Want to see the proof? Want to get that power? The power's in the knowledge, but it only comes to you when you know what your ancestors did, because only then do you know what you can do. The power's in the knowledge,